Well, now it is time for Parler to respond to Amazon's response to Parler's lawsuit.
That doesn't make sense.
Viva Frei, Montreal litigator turned YouTuber, and it is part 3 in the Parler versus Amazon lawsuit. Now, I have already done 2 vlogs on this issue, breaking down Parler's lawsuit against Amazon and Amazon's response, so if you haven't watched those vlogs, go give them a watch, but just a 30-second overview. Parler is, or was, but probably will continue to be in the future, a Twitter-like platform based on free speech where people can go and make their tweets, although they're called parlays, on Parler, post pictures, etc., etc. Less than a week ago, and on the basis of the events that took place on January 6th on Capitol Hill, Google and Apple pulled the app from their stores, and Amazon shut down their web services to Parler. As of the present date, Parler has not yet sued Google or Apple, although I suspect that lawsuit is in the mail, but they did in fact sue Amazon on 3 separate grounds. One ground was violation of the Sherman Act antitrust laws, the second ground was breach of contract, and the third ground was tortious interference with business expectancy. I broke down Parler's lawsuit, in which they are requesting a temporary restraining order. Amazon filed a response to Parler's lawsuit, which I also broke down. Amazon raises a number of defenses, first of which is that they were not acting in concert with anybody or conspiracy with anybody to violate the provisions of the Sherman Act antitrust laws. Amazon's second defense was that they were not in fact in breach of the agreement, that it was in fact Parler that breached the agreement and they were entitled to do what they did. And the third argument is that Amazon is in fact protected by Section 230 immunity in the Communications Decency Act. Those were Amazon's grounds of defense in response to the lawsuit filed by Parler, and Parler has now filed a response to Amazon's response. Now, for those of you who may not know, just a brief crash course in Procedure 101, although I'm not exactly certain what the procedure is in Washington state, but this is generally the procedure that follows from all lawsuits. As I have said time and time again, litigation is a two-way street, and what usually happens is that a party files a lawsuit, the defendant files a defense, and the plaintiff can file an answer to the defense. Depending on the jurisdiction, you do not necessarily need to file a response to the defense, but it does good to do so that you can respond to the allegations raised in defense to the initial lawsuit. And this is the procedure for the lawsuit as a whole, but you have within a global lawsuit, you might have these mini lawsuits, like mini motions on specific issues, which will typically follow the same procedure. And right now in the Parler versus Amazon lawsuit, you're going to have a global lawsuit, but right now we are having a fight over the temporary restraining order that Parler is requesting and that Amazon is contesting. But all good stories begin with the introduction, so let's get to Parler's introduction in their response to Amazon's defense to their lawsuit. Introduction. As with its, quote, suspension, end quote, of service to Parler, AWS's opposition to Parler's TRO motion depends on speculation and falsehood. For example, to avoid a clear 30-day notice requirement for terminating its contract, AWS claims its action against Parler was a, quote, suspension, end quote, not a termination. But the indisputable facts show that AWS's action was termination. During the final call between Parler and AWS before the latter pulled the plug, AWS officials told Parler's officials that there was nothing Parler could do to get its service back. Even more perniciously, AWS's opposition relies heavily on the assertion, at paragraph 7, that, quote, Parler was used to incite, organize, and coordinate the January 6th attacks on the US Capitol, end quote, but AWS offers no evidence to support that assertion, only unsupported speculation from reporters. And AWS has confirmed that none of the arrested participants in that unconscionable attack, who had been publicly identified as of the filing of this action, even had a Parler account, much less used it to, quote, incite, organize, or coordinate, end quote, the attack. For these and other reasons, AWS's attempt to defeat Parler's TRO motion must fail. Parler has a high likelihood of prevailing on at least one of its claims, it has established irreparable injury in the form of high likelihood of being forced out of business forever, and it has shown that the equities and the public interests all weigh in favor of a TRO. At a minimum, Parler has established the requisite, quote, serious questions going to the merits. In order for a petitioning party to obtain temporary restraining order relief or injunctive relief before the court, there are a number of criteria that they must satisfy in order to obtain that relief. It was actually fleshed out more thoroughly in Amazon's response than it was in Parler's initial lawsuit, but typically you have to prove balance of inconvenience, irreparable harm, color of right, and there was a fourth one. Balance of inconvenience. Oh yeah, and likelihood to succeed on the merits of the lawsuit. In its defense, Amazon argued that Parler would not succeed on proving these 4 criteria. I happen to humbly disagree. I think it's quite clear that Parler will suffer irreparable harm in the absence of a temporary restraining order. I think it is clearly obvious that the balance of the inconvenience weighs in favor of Parler, in that Amazon will actually suffer no harm whatsoever if all they have to do is host the Parler platform, get paid to do it, while ensuring that there is no offensive, illegal, or objectionable content on Parler's website. That is all Amazon would have to do, the alternative is that Parler goes out of business forever. Or at the very least, risks going out of business forever. So among those two balances, which one weighs more greatly in favor of the issuance of a TRO? With respect to succeeding on the merits of the action, I think Parler has a darn good argument, if on nothing else other than the breach of contract argument. For each claim, Parler has demonstrated a likelihood of success. 1. AWS, not Parler, breached the parties' agreement. AWS claims at 7 that Parler failed to identify the specific term of the contract that AWS breached. Yet Parler quoted from the specific term of the contract, section 7.2b. And that section entitled, quote, termination for cause, end quote, only allows for termination for a, quote, material breach, end quote, of the agreement if that, quote, material breach remains uncured for a period of 30 days from receipt of notice by the other party, end quote. AWS cannot satisfy the contract because it terminated the contract just over 24 hours after giving notice of what it deemed a material breach. At no time before January 9, 2021 did AWS notify Parler that Parler was in material breach of the agreement, thus blindsiding Parler. And in the period up until then, AWS implicitly assured Parler that the two companies had a positive relationship that would continue into 2021. Not only do I believe that Parler has a very strong argument for breach of contract, I actually think that Amazon's defense implicitly, if not explicitly, recognizes that they were in fact the ones who breached the agreement. Amazon's defense, if you can actually believe it, is that they didn't terminate Parler's account, they merely suspended Parler's account. Suspended Parler's account without any notice or warning or period to cure whatever default was the basis for the suspension. They didn't terminate the account, they just suspended it. And when I say that this defense, in my opinion, implicitly recognizes that Amazon was in fact in breach of the contract, it is because it implicitly recognizes that Amazon could not terminate the contract without itself being in breach of that contract. But a suspension with no notice and no period to cure effectively denies any meaning to a cure provision in the agreement in the first place. So what Amazon is effectively arguing is that they could suspend without warning and without giving a period to cure, whereas they recognize they could not terminate without warning and without giving a period to cure, but that would effectively deny any meaning whatsoever to the cure period for termination. A party cannot do indirectly that which they are forbidden to do directly, and that is effectively what Amazon is arguing it's able to do. They could suspend without notice, they could suspend without giving a period to cure, but they can't terminate without giving a notice or period to cure. And you don't need a law degree to know that that doesn't make any sense. And Parler goes on to affirm and re-allege that it did in fact respect all of its obligations under the agreement with Amazon. After Twitter banned President Trump on January 8th, the increased new users and activity caused Parler to go down for 7 hours, resulting in a backlog of 26,000 instances of content that potentially encouraged violence. However, over the next 2 days, Parler was able to systematically remove almost all of this content, which progress was reported to AWS, and within 48 hours by the end of day Sunday, when AWS shut Parler down, Parler had removed all but some 1,000 problematic posts. Parler also identified additional steps it was taking to quickly identify and remove problematic content. Indeed, AWS had known since mid-December that Parler would be adopting in 2021 an artificial intelligence AI system that would pre-screen inappropriate content, which had shown promising initial results, and there was discussion of Parler adopting AWS's own AI system. But in the end, none of this seemed to matter to AWS. You may recall from Amazon's defense is that they said they were not satisfied that Parler would be able to adopt a system, implement a system so that it would remove offensive or inappropriate content from Parler. And in this two-way street of litigation, in its response, Parler is saying not only did we have a system in place, not only were we actively responding to what was going on, but we were going to implement something new in 2021. Amazon knew about it, and we were even talking about adopting Amazon's own AI. As we say in the legal world,
explain it to me, Lucy.
And on the question of suspension that AWS raised in its defense, Parler responds as follows. Additionally, AWS claimed it, quote, suspended and did not terminate the account, end quote. It is true that in an email to Parler, AWS used the term, quote, suspend. However, the agreement only authorizes a, quote, temporary suspension, end quote, and two things make clear that there was nothing temporary about AWS's actions. First, the very next sentence in the email after notifying Parler that AWS would, quote, suspend Parler's account, end quote, was this, quote, we will ensure that all of your data is preserved for you to migrate to your own servers, and will work with you as best we can to help your migration, end quote. It makes no sense for AWS to migrate all of Parler's data off of AWS's servers for a temporary suspension. Second, after the email notifying Parler that its account would be, quote, suspended, end quote. In conversations with Parler, AWS made it clear that there was nothing Parler could do to continue its relationship with AWS and that this was no mere temporary suspension. Thus, by its words and actions, AWS evidenced that whatever it wanted to call it, AWS was permanently terminating its agreements with Parler for Parler's alleged breach of the agreement. And according to the agreement's plain terms, a termination for a material breach required 30 days notice, which notice AWS did not provide, thus clearly breaching the contract. Parler then goes on to hypothesize why Amazon would want to breach its agreement with Parler, and in so doing brings us into the second response to the second defense raised by Amazon, which relates to tortious interference with business expectancy. Why would AWS so willfully breach its contract with Parler? First, Amazon was getting pressure from its progressive employees to use the Capitol riot as an opportunity to suppress conservative voices. And Amazon succumbed to that pressure the same day it was applied. Second, Amazon apparently wanted to support the effort in some circles to deny any meaningful social media platform to Trump, while at the same time protecting its major client, Twitter, from the economic fallout of Trump's moving from Twitter to a competitor. Of course, without discovery, Parler doesn't know for sure at this point why AWS chose to breach its contract, but it doesn't have to establish a motive for the breach. It is clear that a breach occurred. AWS tortiously interfered with Parler's business expectations. AWS contends that Parler cannot meet several elements necessary for a claim of tortious interference. First, AWS argues that it was merely asserting its right to, quote, suspend Parler, and therefore Parler lacked a, quote, reasonable expectancy and cannot assert an interference claim. As noted above, however, this argument collapses in the face of the fact that AWS A, in substance, did not suspend but rather terminated Parler's service, and B, did so immediately without waiting the required 30 days. Amazon's defense that it did not tortiously interfere with Parler's business expectations because it wasn't a termination but only a suspension is not going to go very far. In my humble opinion, in this context, suspension versus termination is a distinction without a difference. Either Amazon had the right to do what they did or they didn't. If they did not have the right to do what they did, there is no doubt they tortiously interfered with Parler's reasonable business expectations. And I cannot believe I got that all out in one breath. AWS further posits that, quote, Parler has not alleged any interference was for an improper purpose or done through improper means. Yet Parler's complaint clearly alleges that AWS terminated Parler's account for, quote, political animus, end quote, and, quote, to reduce competition in the microblogging services market to the benefit of Twitter, end quote, a much larger customer of AWS than Parler. And Parler documented the rising threat that Parler was to Twitter, and how AWS ignored more egregious behavior on the other side of the political spectrum by Twitter. Thus, Parler has patently alleged that AWS interfered with the contracts Parler had with its 15 million users, as well as the millions it was expecting to gain in the next short while out of, quote, greed, retaliation, or hostility, end quote. In its response to Parler's allegations that there were Sherman Act antitrust violations, Amazon argues that Parler did not specify how competition was harmed.
Not the strongest argument.
Finally, AWS claims that Parler failed to explain how competition was harmed, despite Parler's repeated emphasis on how Parler usage had exploded in the weeks before AWS pulled it down, demonstrating a real market need for the more open microblogging platform that Parler can no longer meet. Indeed, Amazon and Twitter, as two of the largest tech companies in the world with a mutually beneficial contractual relationship, had a clear interest in eliminating an up-and-coming service like Parler with such a demonstrable market. This is a quintessential Section 1 claim, and Parler is thus likely to prevail on the merits. That is to say, Section 1 of the Sherman Act, the antitrust violations that Parler is alleging in its lawsuit. And then Parler responds to Amazon's defense, claiming Section 230 immunity to deprive Parler of the ability to sue Amazon for what it did. Section 230 does not bar Parler's interference or antitrust claims. AWS's immunity defenses under Section 230C1 and C2 of the Communications Decency Act, which AWS correctly does not assert against Parler's breach of contract claim, also fail. AWS's Section 230 claim fails on a plain reading of the statute. 47 U.S.C. Section 230C1 simply forbids any, quote, provider or user of an interactive computer service, end quote, from being, quote, treated as the publisher or speaker of any information provided by another information content provider, end quote. Here, Parler does not attempt to treat AWS as a publisher or speaker, nor could it. Under Section 230F2, AWS is an interactive computer service, as is Parler. Thus, Section 230C1, by its terms, shields AWS from liability only for actions or statements, quote, authored by someone else, end quote. But it is not a complete bar to liability for all wrongdoing. Indeed, because antitrust claims do not treat interactive computer services as content providers, at least one court in the Ninth Circuit has held that Section 230 does not bar antitrust claims against media companies. The same logic applies to Parler's interference claim, whereas here a party is attempting to hold an interactive computer service liable for its own unlawful conduct and not for the conduct or speech of others. Section 230 poses no bar. This is a very interesting Yeah, okay, there's some noise here. Let's just wait a second. All right, we don't know how long this is going to go on for. It could go on for the rest of the day. This is a very interesting argument, and I know which side I find myself on of this argument, but I definitely understand the other side. I especially understand it in light of how the courts have applied Section 230 immunity as basic blanket immunity. So while I know what I believe, I am genuinely curious to see how the courts interpret this argument and who they give reason to. And then on the criteria for the issuance of a temporary restraining order, Parler clarifies the following. By establishing a likely threat of extinction if the TRO is not granted, Parler has demonstrated that it will suffer suffer irreparable harm. Even AWS's own cherry-picked exhibits admit that its actions have left Parler, quote, suddenly fighting for its life, end quote, and, quote, all but killed, end quote. Entirely unable to operate its online business or generate revenue, Parler now faces a real, non-speculative threat of, quote, extinction, which, as the Ninth Circuit has repeatedly affirmed, quote, is enough to establish irreparable harm, even when damages may be available and the amount of direct financial harm is ascertainable, end quote. There is minimal doubt that Amazon, through its actions, is harming Parler's goodwill and clientele. The only question is whether or not they have the right to do it under the contract. So at the very least, as relates to the issuance of a TRO, I think Parler has the better argument here. The balance of equities and public interest weigh in Parler's favor. AWS does not deny that under the sliding scale approach of Alliance for the Wild Rockies versus Cottrell, a strong showing on one TRO element, particular balance of the equities, can offset a weaker showing in another. And AWS tacitly admits that the balance of equities sharply favors Parler. Although AWS briefly speculates against logic that it will risk greater pro-Parler outrage if ordered to reverse course, it otherwise fails to deny that AWS itself would suffer little to no inconvenience if enjoined from abandoning the bargain into which it knowingly entered. And Parler's response to Amazon's defense to Parler's lawsuit concludes by stating as follows. Rather than fight on properly framed but unavailing terms, AWS tries, at 12, to eliminate the sliding scale altogether by hammering the balance of equities and public interest elements into one factor, thereby co-opting the public's interest as its own. But even properly viewed as a separate element, this claimed risk to the public interest is a mirage. First, AWS is fully aware that Parler's content moderation issues that arose in the wake of last week's violence at the Capitol were attributable to exceptionally acute infrastructure stresses precipitated by an unprecedented spike in new Parler users and exacerbated by AWS's eventual inability or unwillingness to help their own client, quote, cope with these technological problems, end quote. Now, I'm not sure I am in love with this admission from Parler because I can imagine how Amazon is going to exploit it, but it is very easy to be a backseat driver, or in this case, a front seat vlogger. Bada bing, bada boom.
Booyah.
Second, contrary to AWS's claimed worries that hosting Parler will pose future public risk, including at the presidential inaugurations, AWS was aware that, at the time it elected to terminate services to Parler, the latter was already taking steps, including discussions to use Amazon's own AI software, precisely to avoid such a risk. Amazon's desire to escape a contractual obligation and thereby crush a much smaller company with minimal inconvenience to itself does not implicate a substantial risk to the public interest, but weighs decisively against that interest. The TRO is more than warranted. Conclusion: for the foregoing reason, Parler's TRO motion should be granted. My camera battery is going dead, so I have to end this vlog, but I am making my formal prediction. Yes, I am aware of all the issues affecting the courts. I am predicting that Parler is going to obtain its TRO. There, I said it, the prediction is out there. I cannot take it back because once it's on the internet, it is out there forever. We will see if I turn out to be right or wrong. Setting all that aside, if you like my content and you like my videos, please be sure to like, share, subscribe, hit the notification bell, and drop a comment in the comment section below because it feeds the algorithm.
Feed me all night long.
If you want to support the channel, all of these support links are in the pinned comment. We've got PayPal, Patreon, subscribe to our YouTube membership. We've got merch, Keep Calm and Vlog on. Robert Barnes and I, in addition to doing weekly streams, have a page on Locals. It is called vivabarneslaw.locals.com. I am on Rumble, where you can watch all of my content as well. But more important than any of that, take care of yourselves, check in on friends and family, make sure everyone around you is doing well, exercise, vitamin D, vitamin C, activity, and now you know your vlog. Peace out. Booyah!
Dirty.